Hello, friends, and welcome back to another edition of Pastor's Ponderings. Today, we have the exciting task of looking at one of the parts that is perhaps the most memorable part of our worship together, and another part that is arguably one of the most unifying and binding parts of our worship as a Christian people. Today, we'll pause and we'll take some time to look at the sermon and the creed. At the conclusion of the gospel, the congregation is seated, and some time is taken for the pastor to share what we call a homily or a sermon. Now, we've not quite reached the pinnacle of our worship together just yet, but that doesn't mean that the sermon isn't an incredibly important aspect of the worship that we share. For one reason, the sermon is perhaps the most memorable part of our worship together. How often do we leave church and throughout the week ahead, the thing that really sticks with us is some image or story or saying that we heard about in the sermon. The sermons give an opportunity to share some sort of insight that really goes with us in the week ahead. Additionally, the sermon is an opportunity for the pastor to do some teaching of the congregation. Often, as we read the scriptures, they're pretty plain and straightforward. We can get the basic message as we read them. That's part of their beauty. You don't have to be educated to pull something from the scriptures. But the scriptures can also be an incredibly complex work. And so sometimes, as a pastor, it's an opportunity for us to share some different perspectives that might not be at the forefront of our mind when we read. Sometimes it allows us to pick the scriptures apart and come at from different angles and to open them up a little more broadly than we can do with just a quick, plain, simple reading. And finally, perhaps the most important part of the sermon is that the sermon becomes the church's living voice in the world today. The scriptures are old. They're 2,000 years old at this point, and that's part of their beauty and the dignity that they hold and why we hold them in such high regard, because God has created such a wonderful masterpiece of self-revelation through them. But sometimes when we get far apart from a work between us and our modern lives, it can create somewhat of a disconnect. And so I think one of the most important parts of the sermon is that it takes these old scriptures and it presents them in a way that says these old scriptures matter to our lives right here, right now, today. One of the big differences between Christianity from other religions is that Christianity is understood to be an orthodoxic faith. Orthodoxy means that you're focused on right belief. Understanding truly who God is unlocks many of the riches and the blessings and the wonderful understandings that this faith has to offer. Other religions around the world, such as Islam, for example, would be considered more of an orthopraxic faith. The focus is more on right practice. It's more about what you do than having this perfect understanding. But as Christians that are an orthodoxic people, one of the greatest gifts that we have been given throughout the ages are the creeds of the church. In church, if we're having a feast or if we're celebrating communion, we tend to recite the Nicene Creed together after the homily. Or if we are not having communion, or especially if we're having a baptism that day, we'll recite together the Apostles' Creed, which is the slightly shorter one. But as we look to the history of the creeds, we find that they actually date back even before we had our Bible. So before all the books were put together and understood to be the canon that we call the Bible, the church had creeds that it was using to guide its faith and its witness and its understanding of what this Christian faith is and who the God is that we worship. Even before many of the scriptural books were written, we have evidence of primitive creedal statements where Christians wanted to understand we're a part of this faith, but what are the details of it? What are the boundaries that we don't cross? What are the pure understandings of who we are? And so early, back before even AD 100, we have statements by Christians that were brief creedal statements saying, this is the Christian God that we worship. This is the faith that we hold. And then as you get into the 300s, you get the creeds taking form in the shape that we pretty close to what we recite today. And in the later 300s is actually where the Bible comes together. And so the creeds are statements that establish the boundaries of what Christianity was and who God is long before we even had many of our other governing documents, such as the scriptures themselves. And so they're a beautiful gift to us as we recite them together. But some of the function that they play is that they do put some boundaries on who we are as a people. They say clearly, this is what Christianity believes. This is who God is. And as they set those boundaries, they protect us from wandering off in directions that might be harmful down the road. For example, in the early church, there was a heresy called Arianism, where some people were believing that Jesus was a really great guy, maybe even a prophet, but he wasn't fully God. And so as the church thought about that and they struggled with it, and they started to think, okay, many people believe that, but what are the implications of that belief down the road? They began to realize, well, if Jesus isn't fully God, then what does that mean for our salvation? If he didn't have the power of the divine, then how did he have the power to save us? And so in the creeds, we have statements like, we believe in Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, where we're saying clearly, Jesus is God. So the gift of the creeds are that they help establish what it is precisely that we believe as a Christian people. And as we recite those creeds together each and every Sunday, they give us the beautiful gift of connecting us with Christians all over the world, who in countries all over this globe are reciting that very same creed together with us. And it connects us with Christians throughout time who have recited that exact belief with us. So the creed is something that protects us from wandering into belief that might be dangerous or take us away from the faith. And it also becomes an incredible gift that connects us with God's holy people around the world throughout time.